like to thank personally Lidiya because we have been abusing her for many years. In 2007, she was instrumental for us to get the consultative status at ECOSOC. She guided us to do all the proceedings, and in 2018, she helped us very much in the commemoration of our 10th anniversary at the Palais des Nations. Then 2019, again, she participated at the session that we had on gender issues, our intergenerational dialogue. And now again, 2020, in this confinement, we ask her to contribute once more to Greycells. Thank you very much, Lidiya, for participating. So Cécile Molinier, who's hearing you and who was the REST rep of at Geneva, she will make an introduction. She knows you very well. Please, Cécile.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Can you hear me okay? Okay. For those of you who do not know me, because I can see a few faces on the screen, which I'm not familiar with, I'm a member of the executive committee of Greycells, and before I retired, I was the director of the UNDP's office in Geneva, and before that, I was the UNDP resident representative and the UN resident coordinator in 3 countries in Africa. I do not mention that to brag, but because it is actually directly connected to my very brief introduction to what Lidiya is going to say, I just wanted to say a few words about my personal experience of a role played by NGOs and civil society in general in development. And I would say that that role is both absolutely essential and highly sensitive. And this is what I experience in the field and also in the work that I do office. Also, while I was working with UNDP, in 3 capacities, I would say, one of them being as implementing agent for a number of projects dealing essentially with poverty alleviation and with health or education interventions, and also very much so with HIV/AIDS. The second role with which I'm familiar is NGOs as very active and vocal development actors. And I would say the third role that they are playing, and more, is to be strategic partners, in particular in the context of developing, monitoring and implementing the MDG framework up till 2015, and now the SDG framework. I will not delve on that, but I thought that it would be interesting to remind all of us of the role that civil society has been and needs to continue to play to hold us. And when I say us, I mean us working in or familiar with international organization and multilateralism in general, to hold us accountable, actually, and to hold also decision makers, government leaders accountable to the commitments that they have made in the context of the development framework in which we are operating. And I would say that nowadays in particular, their voice is needed more than ever. And I'm sure Lidiya is going to tell us about all of the engagement and interaction with activists, with youth groups, with women being very, very strong, but unfortunately not listened to as it should have been. I will say 2 or 3 words. Lidiya, don't worry, of introduction about you. It will be very quick. Lidiya, as Alejandro mentioned, is a good friend of Greycells. We've had plenty of opportunities to appreciate her help and support. She's been heading the NGO Liaison unit in the office of the Director General at UNOG for a few years now. And before she was at UNOG, she was working with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on human rights issues, and in particular the interaction with civil society. And prior to that, Lidiya was working with the OSCE, starting in Tashkent, if I'm not mistaken, which is your hometown. A very nice city, by the way. I enjoyed my few days in Tashkent a lot. And after Tashkent, she moved to the OSCE office in Warsaw, where she was already working on human rights and civil society issues. Thank you very much, Lidiya, for being with us. And I will give the floor back to Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Cecile. Now we can just start the session. So Manuel is going to chair and to be our disc jockey to give the floor, open micros and windows. So go ahead, Manuela.
Thank you. I will do my best as this jockey. Just as a reminder to those who are joining now, the questions, you can write the questions because your mics are closed to improve the quality of the sound. Just write on the chat icon that you have at the bottom that opens the column on the right. And then I will try to read what are your questions and to manage or regroup them as necessary, and so that Lidiya can comment and reply. So Lidiya, the floor is all yours. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Manuela. Thank you so much, Alejandro and Cecile, for the very nice introduction. Actually, Alejandro just historically reminded that I was engaging once a year with Greycells. I think we should multiply that engagement maybe. Hello everyone, greetings from Ferney-Voltaire, where I am based. I hope you are all safe and staying at home, as all of us these days. Thanks, first of all, to the Greycells for bringing us virtually together today. Again, as introduced, I've been working very closely with Greycells, especially in the context of the intergenerational dialogues, which are a very good and interesting format that they have created in Geneva. And I think it's a great idea to organize these Greycells, Grey Talks online at a time when we cannot meet in person. So thank you very much. I was very pleased when Alejandro proposed me to speak about the role of civil society and NGOs before and after the COVID-19 pandemic, because of course the subject interests me a lot. I've been working with NGOs for the last 20 years in the context of the UN, of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, of the regional organization before. So it's an interesting topic to reflect on, and I will be actually interested to hear also your reflections and your ideas on how you see the situation for the civil society develop. We live in a very strange historic moment now. The moment that will, for long, will define our life to before and after, and beyond the immediate fears and the immediate worries that we have, the distractions and disruptions in our everyday life. It's this realization that from one day to the other, just like that, the fundamentals of our life, the things that we always took for granted, have just been changed and turned upside down, and not just in one country or region because of conflict or natural disaster or something else, but for all of us across the globe. And it's like being in a movie, only it's not a movie, it's real and it's happening still. And I guess for civil society and for NGOs, there will also be the before and after, but also during, of course. So it's very interesting to see together today how the before looked like, and to reflect on how the after might look like and how it will impact the current situation. The current situation might impact the NGO activities. So I will try to make some assumptions, and I will of course try to connect them to the work of the United Nations where I am working at the moment. So what if we started just from the basics? What if we started with the question of what are NGOs and what do they do? Of course, it's a seemingly simple question, but apparently complicated enough not to have an internationally recognized definition of NGOs. Because NGOs come in different shapes, forms, and sizes. Surely, NGOs constitute a part of civil society. Certainly, they are not criminal groups and supposed to be a part of not supposed to be a part of a government, and they are not-for-profit organizations, not businesses, but many are funded by governments, by foundations, by businesses, or private persons. Some don't get any funding, and they are just run by volunteers who support the NGOs. Some NGOs can be the fronts and outfits for the political faith of other interest groups and different kinds of lobbyists. They can be organized at different levels, at local level, national, regional, international. Compare, for example, the Médecins Sans Frontières, which is a big NGO, or a local village group of volunteers who are helping some elderly persons. These are two NGOs, and yet there is a world apart between these two kinds of groups. So NGOs engage in a wide range of activities, and they perhaps could broadly be divided into two types: operational NGOs and advocacy NGOs, or there might be also the combination of the two, of course. And much for the diversity about what the NGOs are and how they look like, there is also a broad range of things that they do, from human rights to humanitarian assistance, from conflict prevention to development, from poverty eradication to education, from migration to health, and many other issues that NGOs are working across the globe. Over the years, collectively, NGOs have made a major contribution to the humanity. If we look, for example, at their relationship with the United Nations, which has been established from the very beginning of the United Nations itself, there are many examples of achievements that the NGOs pushed through to the United Nations. Coalitions of NGOs have organized themselves to get the General Assembly and other UN organs to pass resolutions on disarmament, on human rights, on development and other issues. They have helped to develop new treaties and new UN institutions like the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for example. They were important in the development and establishment of the International Criminal Court. They were putting new issues on the agenda of the United Nations, like landmines, environment, women's rights, or child soldiers, issues that have not been brought to the table by the governments, but by NGOs. NGOs, of course, deliver humanitarian assistance alongside the UN entities. They assist refugees. They work on development in society that experienced violent conflicts. Cecilia has a lot to offer on reflections about that, I'm sure. NGOs promoted the realization of the Millennium Development Goals, as she already mentioned, and now the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda as well. So there were many things that the NGOs have been doing before in the world, which has had its multiple challenges already. And I think it's actually useful to reflect for a moment on those challenges because they are very relevant to the contexts in which NGOs operate and will continue to operate. When addressing the General Assembly on the priorities of the United Nations for 2020, Secretary General Antonio Guterres highlighted 4 threats that endanger 21st century progress. He called them the 4 horsemen, and they are the epic geopolitical tensions, the climate crisis, global mistrust, and the downsizes of technology. Climate change, for example, is a multiplier of many other threats, from health to poverty to conflict to others. While emerging economies are rising in many parts of the world, inequalities between the rich and the poor and within the communities, they are growing, and the entire regions are failing to catch with the waves of progress because of that. Even in developed countries, systematic societal inequalities are growing, and they undermine the social cohesion, posing a challenge to human development, jeopardizing the fulfillment of human rights, and threatening peace and security. And new technologies, while offering unprecedented global opportunities to transform the sustainable development, they also pose the fundamental legal, social, and ethical questions which are difficult to respond, and they affect us all. So the list of challenges goes on, and they will of course dramatically grow due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the work and activities of the NGOs will also be affected by the challenges that have already existed before. Since the start of the pandemic, the Secretary General has issued an urgent call for global ceasefire and for international responsibility and solidarity, emphasizing that we will face a common threat and that the pandemic is a call to collective action. His call has been endorsed by many member states, by many groups and organizations, including civil society actors and networks. In his recently launched report on responding to the social and economic impacts of COVID-19, he highlighted the important role of civil society and grassroots organizations at the local level. Because in assisting the most vulnerable populations, these groups are active in bringing economic and livelihood opportunities and adapting responses to the community context. These organizations in many locations of the world are the first and sometimes the only point of reference for individuals and for families on the COVID-19 pandemic. So there are many examples already on how NGOs are redirecting their usual activities and launching new initiatives, such as National Emergency Fund to support state medical systems, like what Save the Children is doing in Romania, for example. NGOs nurture local solidarity efforts. For example, in Colombia, 6 organizations joined up their forces to form an alliance to implement a donation system to support the most vulnerable people. Médecins Sans Frontières expanded their activities in Europe in response to COVID-19, and their teams are supporting the nursing homes for the elderly, assisting homeless and migrants, and providing technical support and training. Intersos, an Italian NGO, deployed medical teams to locations where migrants are working in agricultural sector in southern Italy. So these are many, many initiatives that civil society have been doing since the beginning of the pandemic. And conscious of this and many more examples, the Secretary General called for continuing dialogue and exchanges of information with existing networks of civil society actors, and called for identification and engagement of additional civil society partners that work on COVID-19 crisis. The role of NGOs in the humanitarian sector is, of course, very important. We know about that. And on the 25th of March, the Secretary General, when he launched the 2 billion Global Humanitarian Response Fund to fund the fight against COVID-19 in the world's poorest countries, he actually also mentioned that if properly funded, this fund will equip humanitarian agencies and NGOs working hand in hand with the United Nations with medical supplies to treat the sick, and also to help protect healthcare workers. Most recently, he also made a global call for measures to address a global surge in domestic violence directed towards women and girls, because this is something that is linked intimately to the lockdowns imposed by the government in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So there is a lot of things that are already happening in which civil society is having a lot of role to play. And Secretary General's statements also reflect the important role that civil society is playing in dealing with the crisis. But I thought it will be also interesting to see what conditions NGOs are having to do their work and what space is available to them to do their important work. To me, it's a very interesting question because in the last couple of decades, I would say since September 11, actually, from 2001, civil society movements in many parts of the world have been facing increased restrictions when they are trying to carry our activities. It started from affecting first human rights organizations and pro-democracy groups, but maybe in the last 10 years, it has also spread to affect the wider segments of civil society, because more governments have been creating legal and administrative barriers, making it more difficult for civil society organizations to receive funds, foreign funds or domestic funds. In many countries, we've seen restrictions for civil society groups to hold public gatherings, to express their views, or to register as organizations. We've seen tactics to discredit civil society groups, to present them as traitors and to weaken them vis-a-vis general public, which of course reduces the space in which they can operate. We've seen the creation of the so-called NGOs, the pro-government NGOs, which are created to support government's policies, including at the international level. On the contrary, we have seen how critical voices and groups could be sidelined by restrictions imposed on freedom of expression, and impossibility for those groups to make their voices heard at the policy-making levels, at all levels. We have seen how individual human rights defenders and NGOs were subject to intimidation, to harassment and reprisals, including at the international level for their engagement with the international UN system or with regional mechanisms. So these developments have already been shrinking civic space and the space for civil society to operate over a number of years. And this is a global trend. This is not just happening in a few authoritarian countries. It's happening in various countries across the world, including in democracies. And this trend is not likely to vanish probably after the pandemic. On the contrary, it might take even greater proportions. Why am I thinking so? Because in the course of the last months, as we all know, most governments have introduced various emergency measures in an effort to contain the spread of the virus. And unprecedented measures on a global scale, taken in a rush, some of them from one day to the other, without following the normal consultation and decision-making process nationally, often introduced by an executive decree. This is not how things are usually done in most of the countries. Schools closed, businesses shut down, public gatherings banned, people ordered to stay at home, freedom of movement between and within national borders curtailed, unprecedented surveillance measures to monitor people's movements introduced, privacy rights violated, freedom of expression in the context of the so-called spread of false information sanctioned, access to healthcare limited to emergencies only. So non-compliance is of course sanctioned, and the authorities are exercising very unprecedented powers which they didn't exercise before. That's very unthinkable, isn't it? And surely the circumstances required from all national leaders to save lives and to contain the spread of the virus, and extraordinary public health emergency required extraordinary response, because indeed we haven't been in such a global emergency for many, many decades. But the essence remains, those unprecedentedly adopted restrictions affect our human rights. They affect civic space, and by extension, they already affect the conditions and environment for NGOs and for civil society. Because we have seen already humanitarian and development organizations being forced to adapt to this new reality of disruption of their operations, restricted access to the target groups, limited movement, and closed borders. As a side note, it would actually be interesting to explore the legality of many of those emergency measures, because of course states have the right to derogate from their human rights obligations during the state of emergency, temporarily though, under certain conditions. But now, while the measures were introduced, state of emergency itself has not been introduced everywhere, or has not been declared in many countries. In addition, emergency measures are time-bound and should, of course, cease to exist when the emergency is over. However, the danger is that some measures could still remain in place, or they could be easily reactivated next time, not necessarily in an emergency situation, especially in fragile contexts. So all these are interesting signs to look for. Actually, the High Commissioner for Human Rights is going to speak tomorrow virtually on a subject of the impact of COVID-19 on human rights. So that might be interesting to hear. So just to summarize, in terms of civic space and civil society space, I think after the pandemic, the attention should be paid more to the four elements important for the civil society development. One is the regulatory environment and changes in legislation that affect the work of civil society organizations. The other one is the right to participation and difficulties in accessing decision makers and providing inputs into the law and policy making. The third is the harassment and continuing harassment of human rights defenders, including the negative discourse aimed at stigmatizing civil society groups. And the fourth issue is funding. And that's a big issue because it will become probably more difficult to access funds and to ensure sustainability of financial resources for many NGOs, in particular for their long-term activities. Even before COVID-19, we know that funding was already an issue. The humanitarian funding gap has been growing for a number of years. So NGOs will need to be anticipating and adapting their programmatic and business models to this change. The economic downside that will follow the crisis means that the future aid budgets and donations will also likely to decline. So this crisis could also highlight the traditional limits of the work of the NGO, which is the lack of financial resources, essentially, and the dependency on donors. On a positive note, I think that NGOs might have more role to play in shaping multilateralism. Already before COVID-19, multilateralism, as we know, has already been going through a transition. And it was becoming clear that state-centered multilateralism was slowly giving space to the new inclusive and collaborative multilateralism with more actors around the table, including NGOs and civil society. So in relation to NGOs, it's possible that their role could develop and get even stronger after the crisis, because now NGOs are on the front lines of solidarity efforts, assisting the affected communities. And actually their experience in assisting the fight against large-scale epidemics in developing countries, such as Ebola or malaria, have already proven their important role and relevance in supporting the current public health crisis. So I think the role of NGOs in the post-crisis period will be greater in the areas of solidarity and assistance to communities and groups affected by the downturn of economy and by the loss of jobs and livelihoods. We already witnessed that, for instance, women, older persons, persons with disabilities, homeless people, victims of domestic violence, people deprived of their liberty, asylum seekers, and in general low-income persons are more vulnerable, and they will suffer more from the current situation in different ways and in more amplified ways than the other segments of the society. So NGOs could ensure that the needs of those segments of society would be taken into account when the policies are developed related to health or related to economic and social issues after the pandemic. NGOs could also help governments to reach those communities and those populations as they are in direct contact. They have developed this contact and trust already for a long time before the crisis, so that could actually help the government to reach out to those segments. The role of NGOs could also increase in monitoring the implementation of the emergency measures after the return to the normality after the crisis. For instance, in countries where tracking and surveillance during the pandemic was implemented, NGOs could monitor how the obtained data is used in reality, and it is not used beyond the purposes of a narrow definition public health related emergencies. Also, I think that the engagement of NGOs with the United Nations system will only continue to grow. We have seen the interest from NGOs to become associated, and in our office, the UN office at Geneva alone, we currently have 1,500 NGOs accredited on an annual basis. It's already a 4% growth from the previous year, and it's been growing for a number of years. So I think this engagement will only likely to accelerate. So I think I've been speaking for a long time. This is enough, and I will be also interested to hear your views and your ideas on what's the role of NGOs and civil society after the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lidiya. Yes, I will open the session question and answers immediately. And I already have 2 questions. Just as a reminder to everybody, to facilitate the audio connection, Please write your questions on the column on the right with the chat button. And anyway, remember that the whole chat is being recorded and will be available by tomorrow. The video will be available on our website, greycells.ch. So don't write too much, you don't need that. I will just flag the 2 questions that I have already in the pipeline, but then I will immediately open the floor also to other questions and comments, including, of course, those of Cecile, which may be particularly engaged in what was said. So I have a question by Lidiya, a general question on the mechanisms that you put in place at the UN to bring NGOs together on a regular basis. And then I have a question from Vlasta. In fact, 2 questions from Vlasta. One, on what role do you envisage for NGOs in shaping multilateralism as compared to the current one? And the second question, is there any difference in the situation and problems faced by implementing an advocacy NGOs? For the time being, I think you have enough on your plate, Lidiya, right?
Sure.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the questions. To the mechanisms available for NGOs to access the international system, of course, these are many, and that could be a subject of a very long conversation. But I mean, in essence, almost all intergovernmental debates, they have some kind of interaction with NGOs. For example, if we take the Human Rights Council, which is an intergovernmental body which is developing policy on human rights, it gathers in Geneva several times per year, and this is the member states, of course. But NGOs have the observer status, NGOs in consultative status with ECOSOC. Those NGOs that have already been so-called accepted to the club of the NGOs at the UN. They have the observer status, so they can bring their views to that forum. They can submit the written statements, they can speak at the Human Rights Council, they can organize side events. So this is just one example of how the NGOs are bringing their views to the attention of the international community. Of course, they are not then participating in the voting of the resolutions themselves, if the Council is taking action on any resolutions, but they have the chance to influence the policy and the decision-making process before leading to the adoption of those resolutions. On the role of NGOs for shaping multilateralism, this is also how the NGOs are shaping multilateralism, by having access to NGOs. And there is it's been the consultative status between the NGOs and the United Nations has been established for a very long time. NGOs have been engaged in the UN system already since the very beginning, and it was growing and growing and growing. So now we have the multiple numbers of the NGOs working on various subjects. Many NGOs are working just with some agencies, like with UNHCR, for example. NGOs are serving as implementing partners for the projects the UNHCR is implementing for the refugees, for example, on the ground. So NGOs have access to the operational activities of the United Nations. And also, I mean, when I say that the NGOs should probably be having more space at the table, is because the governments now are realizing, hopefully more and more, that they cannot manage by themselves. And this is what we've been telling for a number of years, that governments cannot manage to resolve all the issues that cross borders, that are not only influencing one country, but many countries, like climate change. They cannot resolve it alone. They need to have help of many other actors. They need to have help from businesses, from civil society, from academia, from everybody. So this is hopefully now that the governments are realizing what contribution NGOs are bringing nowadays in the resolution of the COVID-19, and that could continue also afterwards. That's all.
Lidiya, a follow-up to the question raised by Lisha. In fact, a clarification, because in New York, apparently the situation is not exactly the same as compared to Geneva. In New York, there is a platform to bring NGOs together, for instance, in the high-level political forum, while in Geneva, it's not apparently not exactly the same kind of mechanism, including with the major groups and so on. So maybe you would like to clarify or to elaborate on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, we are very proud in Geneva that we have actually built over the number of years the access of NGOs and civil society to the United Nations is very prominent in Geneva. Maybe partially because the human rights system is here and human rights system is not possible to be shaping without the NGOs. That's for sure. I mean, in New York, there are also the forums and the discussions to which civil society has access. If we think about the Commission on the Status of Women, for example, which meets every year, it's an intergovernmental process as well, but NGOs, women's groups, they have direct access to participate in the sessions of the Commission on the Status of Women. If we think about the permanent forum on indigenous issues, it also gathers civil society actors and indigenous groups. But I mean, I agree there is more to be done to bring more voices of civil society to the UN forum. As Cecilia was already mentioned, that the need of those voices will even increase now. So it will be important also for us as civil servants and for us, the people working within the United Nations, to realize the importance of civil society voices and to try to see the ways of how to bring them more to the intergovernmental debates. Thank you.
Thank you, Lidiya. I have two different questions. I will take them separately, so it's easier to reply for you. I have a question from Federica, who is from an NGO called Geneva, who is one of the partners, friend of Greycells, if I may put it in these terms. Geneva is a network of NGOs, but more specifically, they are looking within Geneva at their strategies that they will need in some social issues they are dealing with, the strategies in the post-pandemic phase, and particularly they are, since you mentioned, Lidiya, the business model of NGOs that will have to be revisited now in the new context. This is one of the exercises that Geneva is doing now. So they are, for instance, exploring the impact investing issue, and if you have some suggestions in this regard or in general on the business models of NGOs, that would be wonderful to share your views. And then I will take Cecile's question in a second.
Thank you very much. And it's great to hear also what the NGOs are doing now to already adapt their activities, knowing what will come after the pandemic and how funding will be affected. Of course, that's the big issue. I don't know if I have any ideas on the business models themselves, but certainly the business model in which you apply for a grant, give a grant, and implement activity is not working anymore because it's not sustainable. It's not bringing any long-term solutions. So maybe the NGOs need to be looking at diversifying, first of all, the donors. I mean, even the word donor. I mean, it's like somebody is giving something and then you are implementing the thing that the donor wanted you to do. That should also change. There are crowdsourcing, different options maybe to be examined by the NGOs to see how to support their activities, bringing the private funds, looking at the businesses. Now more and more businesses, especially in the context of the Agenda 2030, they are trying to see how to implement the social program. So that could be perhaps one avenue of accessing for the NGOs in search for funds.
Federica, is it okay with you? Are you happy with it, or you want to add something?
No, well, thank you. Yeah, it's a big issue. We're looking into private funding. We're looking into crowdsourcing. We've done our own experiments this year with crowdfunding. Yes, it's a big challenge for us at the moment. And we are going to more and more to private foundations and business foundations. But yes, it's tough, especially because we are in the sector of prevention and treatment of addiction. And when you were, for example, when you were now mentioning the vulnerable groups, we are a vulnerable group also, our beneficiaries are one of them, but it's not so frequently mentioned because people living with addiction also sometimes have problems related to mental health. And problems related to abuse, and so it's very hard for the collective we are representing, for our beneficiaries to actually stay in this course. So yeah, we're exploring, but thank you for restating what we're also thinking. At least we know we're in the right direction.
Yes,
Cecile,
no, for
maybe?
sure. I mean, this is, if I can just add on that,
Sure.
Manuela, yes.
Sure.
Also, this brings me to the thought that there is also, I mean, among NGOs, there is also a competition, and there is a competition for funds. And sometimes maybe it's better to actually build coalitions and alliances instead of building competitions in order to access funds. So I don't know if that's helpful, but maybe vis-a-vis the organizations and the people, the public funding, the alliances might work better than individual NGOs. So just my 5 cents.
Yeah, thank you, Lidiya. This is also the same conclusion applicable to governments and countries. But anyway, Cecile, maybe you would like to open your mic and raise your question yourself? So I'm not responsible for it, huh?
Okay, so I note, Manuela, you don't want to take responsibility for my question. My point, Lidiya, is that, and I'm sure you felt that also, I would say that the current interaction between key stakeholders, the big categories like governments, civil society, private sector, I would also add, to a large extent, international organizations. Currently, the interaction is characterized by a lot of mistrust. I mean, there's a lot of talk about multi-stakeholder dialogue, how multi-stakeholder dialogue is definitely the key to more impact and better results. But still, in practice, I'm quite sensitive to the high degree of mistrust. And in some cases, and in particular, I'm struck by the strong level of suspicion and antagonism that characterizes the relationships between the civil society and the private sector. And it's particularly sensitive, I would say now, in the context of the implementation of the SDGs, the reaction to the fairly recent partnership between the UN and the World Economic Forum that has given birth to some very strong reactions and some what I almost feel to be a blanket denunciation of any in-depth partnership with the private sector on the part of NGOs and also on the part of a number of UN observers and people who reflect about those issues. So my question is, do you see that changing in the context of a post COVID-19, and if so, what do you feel would be the main changes, or how could some improvement of those relationships be brought about?
Thank you, Cecile. You're not asking easy questions, huh? You could also try to respond to that question yourself from your own experience. But anyway, I will try to respond. Of course, the issue of trust is it's not only that there is no trust between certain, let's say, former traditional partners. There is the global mistrust. The population is not trusting their governments. The governments are not trusting international organizations. Nobody is trusting the businesses. So it's a lot of mistrust in nowadays, which has been already going on for some time. And of course, it will only be exacerbated after the COVID-19 pandemic. And that actually, in relation to the previous question on the funding, I was thinking that for the NGOs, I think what will be important to try to gain that trust and to show that they are trustworthy, that will also be perhaps helpful with the funding, is to think about their governance structures, how they are managed, to think about the transparency of the organization, to put as much information as possible online, for example, and to make sure that all the activities, they are transparent and visible for the target group, but also for the general public, because this is how you build trust, by showing what you are doing and that you are not hiding anything. And also by increasing perhaps the accountability towards the target groups, and then towards, of course, those who are funding the NGOs and those who are entrusting their money, if it's the private funding, to them. Increasing professionalism as well in what they're doing, because sometimes I see different NGOs passing by my office, of course, every day, and you wish you could also organize some courses for the NGOs on how to do, the public speaking, how to do the communication, how to professionalize the good work and the goodwill that the many NGOs are putting into their work. But the manner in which they are doing it is not necessarily increasing trust in them. So there will be a lot to do, I think, on that front. And again, being the part of the networks of alliances is also helpful, because that also shows that you are part of the bigger community, that there are more actors that are trusting you. So I think that will be important. Like being a part of ICVA, for example, the International Council of Voluntary Agencies, which is the humanitarian network of NGOs. If you are part of ICVA, you know that in humanitarian world that you are a trusted partner. So yeah, these are just a few thoughts.
Thank you, Lidiya. I have an excellent question from Saner. Maybe you would like to open the mic, so again, I do not take responsibility for that one.
Okay, Manuela, thanks. The question is just, excuse me, it's in regards to the memo of understanding between the UN and the Secretary General and Mr. Schwab of the World Economic Forum, which I can see some of the benefits of such a cooperation, but having such a strong connection with the World Economic Forum, who we all know is mostly linked to business, it seems that the sort of balance between CSO, governments, and business, in light of the SDG implementation, seems to be now shifting, or has shifted, towards a more exclusive business, government, UN relation. I may be exaggerating, but that's what my question is about. Could you clarify the situation as it is now and what it means for the next 10 years? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think it goes much beyond my professional, let's say, topic that I am dealing with, which is the non-governmental organizations, because World Economic Forum, of course, is not. But I mean, just my own frank perspective is that it's always better to engage than to disengage. And the UN is engaging with different actors. It signed memorandums of understanding with various actors. So why not World Economic Forum? It's a very naive and frank assessment from my side, of course. It's of course more complicated, but I mean, the reality is that you cannot live without businesses. Businesses need to be somehow connected to the work of the United Nations, and they haven't for a long time. I mean, what we have, we used to have the Global Compact for businesses. It's not enough in a way. So I think that the closer relationship doesn't always necessarily mean that there are similar views on many issues, but that's not the point. The UN is entering into partnerships with different actors, those actors with different views. As long as we are moving towards the same values and the same goals, I think we should be engaging. Thank you.
Thank you, Lidiya. I wonder if there are more comments on this issue or totally different comments and questions. The floor is open, totally open to anybody. If you want to come back on a follow-up question, you're also absolutely welcome. Please feel free.
While you are all thinking, maybe I could make some additions, actually.
Sure, absolutely.
While everybody is thinking. No, I just wanted to make a couple of announcements, maybe. I mean, that will be perhaps interesting in the context that we are discussing on the multilateralism. As you all know, the 24th of April is the day of multilateralism. And before the COVID-19, UN office at Geneva has been already planning to organize the whole week of activities and consultations, which is also along the line of UN at 75. The events that would be led by different UN entities in Geneva, together with the young people, and the week of activities was envisaged, which of course now was, well, now of course it cannot happen in the format that was envisaged for the whole week and with the presence of everybody. So the event of the 24th of April itself, the event on multilateralism and the, how is the name? Multilateralism at the time of COVID-19 will be held. It will be from 10:30 to 12 Geneva time, and there will be, of course, information sent, including to NGOs, and it will appear on the UNOG webpage. But it will be a global conversation between the leaders of the UN entities and international organizations in Geneva and young people. It's done together with the University of Geneva, so it should be something interesting, and I invite you to watch out for that. And also that week we'll see the launch of the annual report of United Nations Office at Geneva, which will showcase what we are doing in UNOG for 2019. And also the launch of the UN Geneva new website. We've been revamping the old website for a while now, so it will be launched during that week of multilateralism.
Thank you very much. May I take advantage of having the mic to make also a Greycells announcement, a quick one, which is related to the topic anyway, don't worry. We have been planning since January now our 2020 intergenerational dialogue to be held in November, like last year. And the topic is, what is the role of the NGOs as compared to the decision makers, particularly at the multilateral level, in three topics: gender issues, climate change, and inequalities. Obviously, we will have to, again, revisit the format, even if November is a little bit far away, but still. So I just wanted to alert you, because you will be certainly informed and hopefully participant of this new exercise that has a preparatory process starting now at the end of April. And the other announcement is a technical one, just to remember to everybody that the audio, the video will be available tomorrow in our website, greycells.ch. But other questions, other comments? If not, I would like myself to raise a provocative question, Lidiya.
Another one.
Sorry for that in advance, but it's really something that is on my stomach. But there is just now a question from Lucia Governa. At the post-COVID scenario, where do you think we are heading towards a greater protectionism or a stronger globalization? I don't know if you want to take this one, Lidiya.
I don't know. Maybe Cecile wants to take that one.
Cecile, go ahead.
I'm definitely not better equipped than any of you to answer that question. I mean, the way my very personal reflection, we read more and more that COVID-19 should be, given its impact, its global impact, an incredible opportunity to rethink gradually the world we live in, how we live in this world, and of course, to a large extent, multilateralism, international cooperation, the need to strengthen global cooperation. My sense is that it's either going to be this, really, given the impact of the pandemic, which we have not yet begun actually to fathom because we are right in the middle of it. There is a possibility that leaders and opinion shapers and thinkers will actually be able to think together and look towards a better future. Or there is another possibility, and you alluded to that, Lidiya, when you spoke about what to look for and what to be particularly attentive to after COVID-19 in terms of restricted space, restricted freedoms and liberties and human rights. So there is, of course, a danger that we might be heading towards more restriction, which would mean, of course, more inward looking. But I think if the question was about, opposing protectionism or globalization, I would definitely think, again speaking personally, that after the pandemic, we would no longer go back the same road of globalization that we have been pursuing so far. So I would see an in-depth reflection on how to revitalize global cooperation. I'm sure everybody is by now painfully aware that an issue like a pandemic is not an issue that can be addressed efficiently by individual countries or people, but it does, by essence, require a common response. So I think everybody will have understood that by now. My hope is that we will open more towards cooperation and towards a better understanding of what cooperation means, but not go back to the overall development model that we have been following for the last decades. I see more and more people wondering at the fact that we are rediscovering nature and we can breathe again and the sky is blue again, and we are rediscovering the strength of interpersonal relationships. I do think that will linger after the pandemic. Now the question is, to what extent will there be a real dialogue launched among the key actors? And this is where I'm particularly sensitive to what the Secretary General is calling for. At the same time, my concern is that his voice, initially at least, was rather timid and low-key. I'm glad that now he's speaking more and more forcefully. But I think the question is, to what extent will key actors look to the UN as the platform precisely to turn to launch that revitalized dialogue? I don't have an answer, but this is definitely what I hope the direction will be.
Thank you, Cécile. Jean-Victor has an excellent comment following on the discussion on trust. And he refers to the ILO 100 years experience of tripartism, which means that working together between governments, business, and workers does not mean blind trust. Jean-Victor, maybe you would like to elaborate a little bit on that?
Not really. I think it's self-contained, right? Since the 20s, there was no blank check signed by the workers to the businesses and vice versa, and the governments were not necessarily only acting as intermediary, but they knew they had to work together. And then you find ways, you find rules. So, I mean, I'm not especially aware of what was written or agreed upon between the UN and Davos. But I know that the ILO itself has had a number of initiatives which was only between the ILO and the major businesses, and this in the end was considered as profitable for everyone. So it's not black and white, I mean, but of course, caution is necessary.
Yes, thank you very much. Lidiya, any comment on that?
No, not really.
I wanted, we have online our friend Julien Beauvalet. If I don't see him on the screen. In the meanwhile, Sander had a follow-up on the ILO. Why do the employers' organization representatives block discussions on living wage, which has been part of the ILO constitution since it was created? This is an ILO question. Maybe Jean-Victor has a reply. Or Alejandro, yourself?
Yeah, I think we can talk for hours about that. And actually, one of the sessions that we were hoping to have as a great talk is a session of the latest report of the ILO. Possibly during that session we can discuss it longer and deeper.
Yes, absolutely, Alejandro. Thank you very much. I still do not see Julien. I don't think he's online. Julien is the responsible for the Geneva network of NGO, the CAGI, the Welcome Center that connects the Swiss Geneva authorities with the NGOs based in Geneva, but I do not see him online.
No, he had joined us, but he had apparently some trouble with the connection.
Okay, so maybe unless there are other questions or comments on your side, I just wanted to flag my own concern. As I was saying, I had during many years some stomach ache on that, literally, and it is when I saw that in an earthquake situation, for instance, in an emergency, humanitarian emergency like a earthquake, there is literally a tsunami of NGOs that flood the country and then block the capacity of the government to take decisions. I'm referring particularly to what I saw myself in both countries, in Haiti and Nepal, a few weeks or days after the earthquake, and the complaints of the government unable to monitor which NGO was doing what and when and where and why, and for what agenda, so unable to put together a national prioritization of the emergency and the response to that. So it weakens a government that is already weakened anyway, particularly in countries like Haiti and Nepal and many others. So I was wondering if, Lidiya, from your perspective, I'm not asking if you can solve that, but if you have to face this kind of situation, and if a government comes to you and say, as happened to me, help me put some order in the interventions of the NGOs, but because I am overwhelmed, I'm totally unable to put order. What is your view on this kind of situation? Thank you.
Thank you, Manuela. Well, maybe actually because of those situations, more government have been trying to put strings into the activities of foreign NGOs on their territories and on activities of the national NGOs to be able to be more in control. And of course, government needs to be in some kind of control, but sometimes it's unnecessarily putting the strings then on the NGOs to be able to implement their work efficiently. And of course, there should be coordination mechanisms. And I would think OCHA, for example, as the UN entity, should be having some kind of coordination in terms of the humanitarian response. And in humanitarian settings, there are also the clusters that are led by some UN entities. I don't know, the WASH cluster, the other clusters who are managed by or coordinated by some UN entities in the emergencies. But you are referring, of course, to the specific situations in the specific countries. Now this is unprecedented what we're having now, and this is happening everywhere with everybody in every country at different levels. So I think there is a lot to process in terms of how we are ourselves responding, how the NGOs are responding, how governments are responding, and what kind of mechanisms and cooperation can come out of this. It's a huge challenge, but it's also a big opportunity to come out of this perhaps better than how we were in this before. And before it was like many are referring going back to the after the confinement situation as going back to normal. What we were having before was also not normal in many sense. So this also gives us all the opportunity to build something, a new normal that will be hopefully better than the previous normal. That's my optimistic note.
May I comment something on
Sure,
that, Manuela? Of course, because every time that someone mentions, as you just did, Haiti, that rings a bell to me, and I'm sure also to Jean-Victor Groix, who had a number of missions also in Haiti. I was myself just a few weeks after the earthquake in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, and the first reflex that we had with the resident coordinator and with the UN team in Port-au-Prince was to get together all those who were working with the social security institutions and social protection institutions. And we had a gathering of almost 90 NGOs and associations that were working at that time in Port-au-Prince. And they mentioned in many ways that it was not a matter of will, but that there was some lack of legal obstacles and organization obstacles that did not allow them to work together. Many said, I depend from the Protestant church in Atlanta. Others depend from an NGO based in Germany. Others from an NGO based in Senegal. So say, even if we want, we have a mandate, we have a program, and we are not, in a way they mentioned very bluntly, we're not obliged to collaborate with the others because each of us, we are very, very, very small. That was a big surprise to me that there was no margin to collaboration, even if the will was there. So I believe since then that many things will have to change, and some flexibility should be included in the new way of acting of NGOs.
Yeah, thank you, Alejandro. Indeed, this is probably the root of the problem, or one of the roots. Do we have other questions? Jean-Victor, do you want to say something? No? Other questions, other comments? Maybe, Cécile, can I give you the responsibility of some concluding remarks?
Décidément, Manuela, je ne sais pas ce que je t'ai fait. Actually, it is impossible, actually, to summarize what Lidiya has said. Maybe bring out some highlights, which struck me particularly. I was impressed by your analysis of what one should be particularly alert to in the current context of interaction with NGOs in a context of a global pandemic with the emergency measures that have been taken and the number of questions that are raised and the obvious pitfalls that governments may be tempted to pursue in terms of restriction. If one looks, what struck me also is your optimism about how things could actually work better than they have been working, and the importance of networks and alliances in order to improve and to strengthen coordination. And I think what you've been saying about the importance of networks and alliances, in particular, increased transparency, better communication, stronger accountability, to me, that applies not only, of course, to civil society, but it applies to all development actors. And hopefully, what we are heading towards would be more effective, more networked world where different stakeholders coming from very different horizons and pursuing different interests could actually genuinely work together towards goals that would be agreed upon. So those are some of the ideas that your reflections have generated in me. And I must say, after this discussion, I'm somewhat more optimistic about the prospect that the post-COVID world could be, as you said, definitely not going back to normal, because the world we are living in now and we are living in before the pandemic was anything but normal. I would say we would all agree on that. But I feel more hopeful that we could be heading towards a world where people and the different ways people interact would be able to communicate better and relate better to each other. I will leave it there and give back the floor to Manuela.
Thank you, Cecile, which is, this is what I call closing remarks, but Grigoreva has the last word, just in case. Lidiya?
Thanks a lot, Manuela. No, I have nothing else to add. That was